Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked into that Senate hearing carrying one of the most valuable political identities in modern Washington, the image of a fighter for working families, someone who had stood behind a bar, depended on tips, worried about rent, and supposedly understood what it felt like when ordinary people wondered whether the system even noticed them. She did not present that history as trivia, and she certainly did not present it as a sentimental footnote because the bartender story had become part of the foundation underneath her political brand. Proof that she had not simply studied working class hardship from a policy memo, but had lived close enough to it to claim authority when speaking on behalf of people struggling to pay their bills. Sitting across from her was Marco Rubio, and that detail mattered because Rubio did not need a consultant to explain what bartenders and hotel workers look like at the end of a long shift. His father had worked as a bartender for roughly 30 years. His mother had worked as a hotel maid, and his parents had come from Cuba with very little before spending decades doing physical, ordinary, unglamorous work so their children might inherit something better. AOC had bartended before entering Congress, while Rubio's father had poured drinks for decades because that was not a chapter in his political biography, but the labor that paid the family's bills. That contrast was already sitting in the room before Rubio asked the first serious question, but he did not begin by waving his family history around like a campaign brochure. He listened while AOC laid out the three things she wanted the committee to remember about her record: stopping Amazon's proposed headquarters in her district, championing the Green New Deal, and serving as a voice for working families. Rubio carried a small pocket notebook, the kind of notebook that looked almost aggressively ordinary next to the thick, glossy binder in front of AOC, and he wrote each point down without rushing, without interrupting, without trying to manufacture a theatrical confrontation before the substance had even started. When she finished, he clicked the pen, placed it down, and told her he wanted to go through those accomplishments one by one. That was the first problem for AOC, because slogans are easy to control when they are delivered from a podium, but they become far less comfortable when someone writes them down and starts checking them against results. Rubio began with Amazon, precisely because AOC herself had chosen Amazon as evidence that she had protected her community from exploitation. Her district included parts of the Bronx and Queens, and in 2019, Amazon had announced plans to establish a second headquarters in Long Island City, Queens, a development projected to bring approximately 25,000 jobs with an average salary of about $150,000 per year. Those were not abstract positions hidden somewhere in a government spreadsheet, because 25,000 jobs meant 25,000 opportunities attached to paychecks, households, rent payments, grocery bills, savings accounts, and families trying to climb another rung without asking Washington to write a speech about their dignity. Rubio put the number directly in front of her, calmly and without decoration: 25,000 jobs, average salary $150,000 a year for the people you just told this committee you fight for. The room did not erupt because it did not need to. The number itself was already beginning to do the work. AOC answered with the argument she had used before, attacking the roughly $3 billion package of public incentives and insisting that Jeff Bezos and Amazon did not need taxpayer assistance, while New York schools, NYCHA, and neighborhood businesses had real needs. It was a politically familiar argument, and at the surface level, an emotionally effective one. Billionaire corporation on one side, teachers, tenants, students, and small businesses on the other. But Rubio did not spend the next 5 minutes debating whether Amazon was rich enough, whether Bezos deserved sympathy, or whether giant corporations should receive incentives, because that would have allowed the argument to dissolve into ideology. Instead, he asked something much simpler. What happened after Amazon pulled out? The simplicity of the question mattered because it stripped away the moral packaging and forced the discussion toward consequences. AOC answered that Amazon did not build the headquarters, which was true within the narrative she had presented, but Rubio immediately pushed to the next fact. Amazon still came to New York. The company leased office space in Manhattan and brought around 1,500 jobs, not the 25,000 jobs that had been attached to the Queen's headquarters proposal. Rubio repeated the comparison because the contrast required no ornamentation. 1,500 instead of $25,000, and those 1,500 jobs were not placed in Queens or the Bronx, but in Manhattan, outside the district whose working families AOC had just described herself as defending. Then came the question that punctured the center of the argument about corporate subsidies. Did Amazon receive subsidies for those 1,500 jobs? AOC answered no. That should have sounded like a victory for her argument, because Amazon came to New York without the incentive package, exactly the kind of outcome she had publicly claimed to want. The problem was that the result arrived in a form that exposed the enormous price hidden behind the victory lap. Instead of 25,000 projected jobs in her district, New York received roughly 2,500 jobs somewhere else. Rubio did not have to accuse her of hating jobs, nor did he need to invent motives for why she fought the deal, because the arithmetic was already uncomfortable enough without melodrama. Amazon had arrived anyway. The subsidies attached to the original project were gone, but so were tens of thousands of projected positions that had been tied to Queens. That left AOC defending not simply an ideological principle, but the practical gap between the outcome she celebrated and the opportunity that never materialized. Rubio then returned to one of the central claims used during the Amazon fight, the accusation that the deal represented a massive giveaway that could instead be redirected toward public priorities, such as schools and NYC. He asked the question that should have been asked the moment politicians started talking as though a $3 billion pile of cash had been rescued from Jeff Bezos and returned to ordinary New Yorkers. Did those institutions actually receive that money? AOC's answer moved toward the crucial point that the money was never sitting there in the first place. Rubio seized on exactly that distinction because the approximately $3 billion was not a giant checking account that City Hall had been preparing to hand Amazon while teachers watched from the sidewalk. It consisted of incentives tied to Amazon building, investing, and hiring over time. That distinction demolished the clean political image of politicians storming into a vault, rescuing $3 billion from a billionaire, and carrying it triumphantly back to schools and housing projects. If Amazon did not build and hire at the promised scale, the incentives did not simply transform into an equivalent cash payment that could automatically be spent somewhere else. There was no $3 billion windfall suddenly liberated for NYC, no matching pile of money appearing in school budgets, and no magical transfer from the Amazon project into the pockets of neighborhood businesses. What disappeared instead was the proposed project and the projected employment attached to it. Rubio's point was brutally straightforward. AOC had told constituents she was protecting public money, yet the money she described as though it could be reclaimed was contingent on the very economic activity she helped stop. That was why the Amazon exchange mattered far beyond one corporate development fight, because it exposed the difference between describing a political outcome and measuring it. The slogan said taxpayers had been protected from a billionaire giveaway. The result showed Amazon entering New York without the original package, while the far larger Queens employment plan disappeared. The slogan suggested billions had been saved for struggling communities. The structure of the incentives meant those billions were not simply available to be redirected once Amazon walked away, and the politician who had opened the hearing by emphasizing her intimacy with working class struggle now had to sit across from a senator asking what happened to 25,000 projected jobs averaging around $150,000 a year. Rubio closed that section of the notebook and turned the page, because Amazon was only the first accomplishment AOC had chosen to put on the table, and the next page was about to make the contradiction considerably harder to dismiss. Rubio did not move directly to the Green New Deal because there was another contradiction sitting between AOC's language about working families and the public record she had built around herself. He turned instead to September 2021 when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez attended the Met Gala, an event where tickets were valued at roughly $35,000 per person, wearing the now famous white designer dress with the words "Tax the Rich" stretched across the back in giant red letters. It was almost too perfect as a political image. A congresswoman presenting herself as the enemy of elite privilege while standing inside one of the most exclusive celebrity gatherings in the country, surrounded by people whose wealth made the slogan on her dress look less like a protest and more like set decoration. Rubio did not need to invent a sarcastic punchline, because the optics had already written one for him. He simply started reading what the House Ethics Committee had found. That distinction mattered because Rubio was not citing a conservative activist group, a Republican campaign memo, or some anonymous social media account looking for a viral attack. The investigation came from the bipartisan House Ethics Committee, meaning Democrats and Republicans had participated in examining what happened around AOC's attendance at the event. Rubio went through the findings in the same controlled tone he had used during the Amazon exchange, pointing out that AOC had accepted a custom designer gown and that her staff had sought a dramatic reduction in the rental price from approximately $1,300 to $30. He then moved to the free ticket provided for her boyfriend, valued at approximately $35,000, and noted that this arrangement violated House gift rules. AOC tried to characterize the issues as administrative delays involving her staff, but Rubio kept the focus on what the committee actually concluded rather than allowing the explanation to swallow the finding. The committee ultimately required additional payments totaling roughly $2,700, and Rubio let the contrast hang exactly where it belonged. A politician who had built an entire visual performance around the phrase "tax the rich" had attended a $35,000 per ticket event while becoming entangled in an ethics dispute over benefits associated with that very appearance. The hypocrisy was not complicated enough to require ideological interpretation because the image itself was already politically radioactive. Anti-elite messaging delivered from inside an elite gala, accompanied by disputes over who had paid for what. Rubio's point was not that attending a gala automatically disqualified someone from caring about working people. His point was that a politician demanding moral scrutiny of everyone else's wealth had created a record that deserved exactly the same scrutiny. Then Rubio went somewhere even more damaging, because this time the issue was not a designer gown or a celebrity event, but money moving through political organizations. He raised the role of AOC's former chief of staff, Saikat Chakrabarti, who controlled 2 political action committees and became the subject of an FEC complaint alleging that nearly $900,000 had been transferred from those PACs into private companies he also controlled. Private companies operate under different disclosure requirements than political action committees, and that distinction made the allegation particularly serious in the context Rubio was building. He pointed out that Chakrabarti resigned during the federal investigation, a fact that required no theatrical embellishment because the timeline itself carried enough weight. By this point, the image AOC had presented at the beginning of the hearing was being forced to coexist with a very different set of facts. Rubio compressed the contradiction into a single frame: a $35,000 gala, an ethics finding, disputed payments, nearly $1 million moving through organizations tied to a top political aide, and the same politician insisting she represented working families against a corrupt and privileged system. He asked what that representation actually looked like when measured against the record rather than the slogan. AOC's binder remained open in front of her, but Rubio was now controlling the sequence because each item came from something she had said, supported, worn, promoted, or selected as evidence of her own political identity. The method was devastating precisely because he did not need to invent a caricature of her. He was using the material she had already placed into public life. Only then did he turn to the Green New Deal, the second major accomplishment AOC herself had chosen to highlight. This was supposed to be safer ground for her because the Green New Deal was not a side issue in her career. It was one of the central reasons she had become nationally famous. She described it as the first climate policy framework at the scale the crisis demanded, language designed to make the proposal sound sweeping, urgent, historically necessary, and fundamentally different from the timid half measures she accused Washington of producing. Rubio responded with a question that immediately stripped away the grandeur. What does it cost? AOC answered that it was a non-binding resolution of values and therefore did not carry a direct price tag. For a brief moment, that answer gave her room because technically, a non-binding congressional resolution does not itself appropriate tens of trillions of dollars. She emphasized that the Green New Deal was a statement of direction, a declaration of values, something comparable to the kind of broad national vision that could later become concrete policy. That distinction could sound persuasive if nobody followed it further, because it allowed the proposal to be described as massive and transformative when discussing ambition, but costless when discussing financial consequences. Rubio followed it further. He referenced outside estimates placing the potential cost of implementing Green New Deal style policies as high as $93 trillion and asked how AOC could simultaneously describe the resolution as a framework at the scale required to transform the country while dismissing cost questions by saying it was merely non-binding. That was the contradiction he forced into the center of the hearing. If the Green New Deal was only a symbolic statement of values, then the extraordinary language about its scale and transformative power became harder to defend. If it was genuinely a framework intended to reshape major sections of the American economy, then pretending cost had no relevance became equally difficult. Rubio put the choice directly in front of her without allowing the argument to remain suspended between both positions. Was it the bold framework capable of transforming the country, or was it a free piece of paper that did nothing by itself? It could not conveniently become one when ambition was being praised and the other when cost was being questioned. Then Rubio introduced a statement from AOC's own former chief of staff, and the argument became even more uncomfortable. Chakrabarty had told the Washington Post that the Green New Deal was not originally conceived simply as a climate initiative, saying, "We really think of it as a how do you change the entire economy thing." That sentence cut through the defense that Rubio was exaggerating the proposal's economic reach because the description came from inside AOC's own operation. Rubio asked the obvious question: if her senior aide publicly described the project as a mechanism for changing the entire economy, what exactly had voters been sold when the proposal was presented primarily as an emergency response to climate change? The problem was no longer Rubio's interpretation of the Green New Deal, it was the collision between AOC's public framing and the explanation offered by one of the people closest to its political development. AOC tightened her response, but Rubio did not allow the exchange to turn into a dispute over partisan sourcing, because his source was her own team speaking to the Washington Post. He was not reading opposition research, and he was not quoting a Republican strategist searching for the most damaging interpretation available. The words had come from inside the operation, which meant dismissing them required explaining why the people helping design and promote the proposal had characterized it so differently. That was the pattern now running through the hearing. Amazon had been sold as protecting public money until the mechanics of the incentives were examined. The Met Gala had been sold as an attack on privilege until the ethics findings were examined, and the Green New Deal had been sold as an urgently necessary climate framework until its broader economic ambitions were stated plainly. Rubio turned another page in the notebook because the next question would no longer be about the policies AOC had promoted, but about the measurable legislative record she had produced while promoting them. Rubio did not stay on the Green New Deal because by then the point had already been made, and lingering on it would only have given AOC room to turn the exchange back into a philosophical debate about climate, justice, or the intentions behind a non-binding resolution. Instead, he shifted from rhetoric to output and cited a nonpartisan study from Vanderbilt University that ranked the legislative effectiveness of members of the House. According to the record he placed in front of her, AOC had introduced 21 substantive bills, yet not one received action in committee, not one reached a floor vote, and not one became law. The number was especially brutal because it did not challenge her visibility, her ability to command attention, or her talent for driving national conversation. It challenged whether that attention had translated into legislative results. And once that question was on the table, the contrast between political fame and measurable accomplishment became much harder to blur. Rubio continued by noting that among House Democrats, AOC ranked near the bottom, and among Democrats from New York, she ranked dead last. He brought up Rashida Tlaib, a member of the same party, the same ideological neighborhood, and the same political generation, and pointed out that Tlaib had managed to get a bill signed into law. That comparison destroyed one of the easiest escape routes because it made it harder to blame the entire system, the opposition party, congressional procedure, or some uniquely hostile political environment. Same institution, same barriers, same partisan conditions, different result. AOC began to answer by saying the legislative process was designed to create obstacles, but Rubio stopped the argument before it could become an abstract lecture about how Congress functions. "I'm not questioning the process, I'm reading your record." That was the line at the center of the exchange, because Rubio was refusing to argue about intention when the evidence in front of him was outcome. He was not accusing AOC of secretly wanting her bills to fail, and he was not claiming she lacked conviction, passion, or ideological consistency. He was making a narrower and more damaging case. Whatever the intention, the measurable result remained what it was. In a hearing where AOC had arrived presenting herself as a fighter, Rubio was asking the uncomfortable question that political branding usually tries to avoid. What did the fighting actually produce? By this point, 2 of the 3 accomplishments AOC had volunteered at the beginning of the hearing had been turned against her by the same method. Amazon became a debate over 25,000 projected jobs that never arrived in her district, while the Green New Deal became a debate over whether it was a transformative economic framework or merely a non-binding statement without a direct price tag. Now, her broader legislative record was being placed beside those claims, and the pattern Rubio was constructing was increasingly difficult to ignore. The issue was no longer one questionable policy decision or one awkward ethics finding. The issue was whether AOC's political power existed primarily in the realm of messaging, while the institutional results underneath that messaging remained thin. One line was still left in Rubio's notebook, and it was the line AOC had treated as the strongest part of her identity. "I fight for working families. I was a bartender. I know their lives." He had not touched it during the Amazon exchange, had not touched it during the Met Gala section, and had not touched it while dismantling the Green New Deal framing. That restraint mattered because the working class claim was not another policy proposal that could be reduced to votes or economic estimates. It was personal, moral, and central to the image AOC had built around herself. And instead of waiting for Rubio to attack it, AOC moved first. She leaned forward and turned the working class argument directly against him, bringing up Rubio's Cuban immigrant parents and then connecting his family story to Republican immigration policy. She accused the party Rubio represented of supporting policies that separated immigrant families at the border and invoked the image of children in cages. Then she moved to wages, pointing out that Rubio's party had opposed efforts to raise the minimum wage for bartenders, waitresses, dishwashers, and other low-income workers. This was not the cautious, binder-driven AOC who had been forced to answer questions about Amazon incentives or ethics rules. This was the version of AOC that had made her politically formidable in the first place. Fast, direct, confrontational, and capable of taking an opponent's biography and turning it back on him before he could finish using it against her. Then she delivered the sentence meant to reverse the entire hearing. "Senator, I was working class. You just came from it." It was a sharp line because it challenged Rubio's right to claim moral authority from his parents' labor while suggesting that AOC herself had personally occupied the economic position he only inherited as family history. For the first time in the exchange, the energy moved in her direction. The attack did not miss, and pretending otherwise would weaken the entire moment, because some of what she said was politically effective precisely because it forced Rubio to answer a legitimate contradiction between the working-class biography he often cited and the policies of the party he represented. A weaker response would have been to become defensive, deny everything, retreat behind talking points, or start shouting about Democrats. Rubio did none of those things. He looked down at the notebook, left the pen on the table, and then conceded the part of her argument he was willing to concede. The Congresswoman is right about something. He acknowledged that his party had not always gotten immigration right and referenced his role in the 2013 Gang of Eight immigration bill, noting that some Republicans had never forgiven him for supporting that effort. By doing that, he denied AOC the easiest next move because she could no longer simply accuse him of refusing to admit imperfection. Then Rubio drew the distinction he wanted the hearing to remember. Imperfect policy was one thing. Political performance was another. He cited legislation he had actually helped pass, including the Uyghur-Forced Labor Prevention Act, the Hong Kong-related legislation he referenced, and other measures he presented as evidence that his political career had produced laws rather than only arguments. "That's not a tweet. That's law," was the force of the distinction he was making. He was not claiming that passing legislation made every position he held correct. He was challenging AOC to compare the tangible output of his record with the identity she had built around being a fighter. Then Rubio returned to the sentence she had thrown at him moments earlier. He told her he believed she had been working class, making clear that he was not trying to erase her past simply because it was politically inconvenient. His question was different. What had she done with that experience once she obtained power? That was the pivot that changed the shape of the confrontation, because AOC had tried to turn the hearing into a contest over who had the more authentic connection to working people, while Rubio was turning it into a contest over what each person had produced after gaining a seat in government. Biography mattered, but results mattered after biography. AOC sat back, and the binder that had been open throughout the earlier exchanges now rested closed under her hand. Her counterattack had been her strongest moment of the hearing, and it had landed hard enough that Rubio had been forced to absorb part of it rather than simply dismiss it. But Rubio had survived the attack by conceding what he could, pointing to legislation, and returning the argument to results. He turned to the final page of the notebook, slowly, with something pressed between the pages that was thicker than a sheet of paper. The third line in his notes was still there, untouched. Working families, bartending, lived experience, and the claim that AOC understood the people she represented. That was when the hearing was about to stop being a fight over policy statistics and become something much more personal. Rubio was no longer preparing another question about Amazon, ethics rules, legislation, or economic projections. He was preparing to answer AOC's claim that she had been working class while he had merely come from it. And the answer was not sitting in a think tank report, a committee ranking, or a page of congressional data. It was sitting between the final pages of that small notebook, waiting for him to pull it out. Rubio opened the notebook to the final page, but this time he did not immediately read from it, because the argument had moved beyond committee rankings, legislative scores, tax incentives, and policy frameworks. He repeated the third claim AOC had chosen at the beginning of the hearing, the one she had treated not simply as a political position, but as a credential. I fight for working families. I was a bartender. I know their lives. Then Rubio answered with the part of his own biography that AOC had just tried to reduce to inherited memory. His father had been a bartender, not for a campaign season, not as a transitional job before entering politics, but for decades working hotel bars in Miami and Las Vegas, pouring drinks, clearing glasses, and coming home after spending his nights serving people whose evenings probably cost more than his own family could comfortably afford. His mother had worked as a hotel housekeeper and later as a stock clerk at Kmart until her retirement in 1995, folding other people's sheets, cleaning rooms she would never stay in as a guest, stocking shelves, working ordinary shifts, and living the kind of life politicians regularly invoke while standing beneath television lights. Rubio did not present those jobs as symbols of oppression or as props in an ideological argument. They were simply what his parents did to survive and to build a future after leaving Cuba. That was precisely why the contrast was so damaging. AOC's bartending history had become a recurring political credential, while Rubio was describing parents whose working-class identity existed long before anybody had a reason to put a camera in front of them. Then he moved from work to Cuba, and the confrontation became sharper because the family story was no longer only about wages or occupations. Rubio described a grandfather who later sat in Miami, explaining what communism had meant in practice, not as an academic theory discussed on a university panel, but as a system associated with property taken, neighbors disappearing, businesses confiscated, and ordinary people learning that the government no longer existed to serve them. The point was not subtle, and Rubio did not make it subtle. His family's understanding of socialism came through displacement and memory, while AOC publicly identified with an organization whose language about socialist movements carried an entirely different moral emphasis. Rubio then asked whether AOC was a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. She answered that she was. He cited the DSA's 2021 National Convention resolution expressing solidarity with the Cuban socialist struggle and opposing what the organization described as imperialist aggression against Cuba. That brought the ideological conflict directly into the family history he had just described, because Rubio was no longer asking AOC to defend some abstract academic school of socialism. He was pointing to an organization associated with her that had expressed solidarity with a political tradition his family understood through exile. The timing made the contrast even more severe because 2021 had also seen thousands of Cubans take to the streets demanding liberty. Rubio invoked the protesters shouting "Libertad," the arrests, the repression, and the images of a population openly challenging a system that had existed for more than 6 decades. He reminded the room that he had publicly described those protests as a revolt against socialism, tyranny, lies, and misery. Then he turned to AOC's response and accused her of taking days to speak, before directing criticism toward the United States and the embargo, rather than centering condemnation of the Cuban regime. That was the larger accusation Rubio was building. When people in Cuba were demanding freedom, AOC's instinct, in his framing, was to redirect attention toward America. Whether discussing economics, socialism, or political identity, he kept returning to the same question he had asked throughout the hearing. What happens when the slogan collides with the result? Then he raised another example, her appearance at the Munich Security Conference earlier that year, where she had stated that Venezuela was located below the equator. Rubio's response was ruthless because it required almost no argument. Venezuela is above the equator. That is not a policy disagreement, Congresswoman. That is a map. The force of the line came from its simplicity, because there was no ideological escape hatch, no competing model, no congressional procedure to blame, and no moral framing capable of changing geography. Rubio then fused that mistake with the broader argument he had been making about socialism. Someone willing to speak confidently about systems governing countries like Venezuela should at minimum know where the country is located. It was another example of the gap Rubio wanted the room to see between political confidence and command of the underlying facts. Then his hand moved between the final pages of the notebook and pulled out the object that had been sitting there throughout the hearing. It was an old photograph, faded with age, showing his parents in their work uniforms, his father wearing the service clothing of a hotel bartender, and his mother wearing the plain uniform of a hotel worker. Rubio placed the photograph on the table without dramatizing it, and that restraint made it heavier because the picture did not need stagecraft. It showed two people who had worked ordinary jobs for years, immigrants who had rebuilt their lives through labor rather than through speeches about labor. Rubio looked at AOC and delivered the 10 words toward which the entire confrontation had been moving. My parents were the working class. You are the brand. That sentence was not powerful because it was complicated, and it was not powerful because Rubio had discovered some new ideological theory. It was powerful because it compressed the entire hearing into one accusation. AOC had built political authority partly through the story of having been a bartender, while Rubio was placing decades of his parents' working lives directly on the table and asking the room to decide which version of working class authenticity felt lived and which felt packaged. AOC looked at the photograph, then closed the binder in front of her. The symbolism was unavoidable without needing to invent anything beyond what the moment already contained. The glossy binder filled with prepared material was shut, while the old photograph remained visible on the table. Rubio's notebook, small and plain, had carried the numbers, the questions, and finally the image of two people whose lives had become the foundation of his response. The contrast between those objects mirrored the accusation Rubio had spent the hearing constructing, one side represented through political presentation, the other through memory and labor. And that is where the meaning of the hearing moved beyond Amazon, beyond the Green New Deal, beyond Cuba, and even beyond AOC herself. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is not politically ineffective because she lacks intelligence or communication skill. The opposite is closer to the argument being made. She is a remarkably gifted communicator, and that ability has allowed political performance to become a form of achievement in its own right. Modern politics rewards the clip, the slogan, the viral confrontation, the perfectly framed sentence, and the appearance of fighting even when the legislative scoreboard underneath the performance is far less impressive. That is what Rubio was attacking from the first page of the notebook to the last. Amazon was not merely about Amazon, it was about the difference between claiming to protect working families and measuring what happened to the jobs. The Green New Deal was not merely about climate, it was about the difference between describing something as transformative and retreating to its non-binding status when the price became uncomfortable. Legislative effectiveness was not merely about rankings, it was about whether visibility was producing law. And the final photograph was not merely about Rubio's parents. It was the receipt he used to challenge the idea that working class authenticity becomes more legitimate simply because someone is better at broadcasting it. The real question underneath the hearing was brutally simple. Who is real? Who actually lived the life being invoked? Who produced results after gaining power? And who learned that political identity could sometimes substitute for political accomplishment? Rubio's parents never needed an audience to prove they were working class because they had shifts, uniforms, bills, and decades of labor. AOC built part of her national identity around having once stood behind a bar, and Rubio used that contrast to make the argument as personal as it could possibly become. A brand requires people to watch it. A life exists whether anybody is watching or not.